All right. So thank you all very much for joining us today. As a very brief introduction to myself, this event, and my co-panelists, this event is going to focus on TikTok and U.S. national security. Joining me, Dr. Milton Muller and Dr. Kareem Farhat of the Georgia Institute of Technology School of Public Policy Internet Governance Project are going to discuss their newly released research paper that conducted the first thorough, and I would argue publicly available, national security threat analysis of TikTok. With this discussion, we're attempting to provide perspective on this issue about TikTok from hypothetical risks to operational and technical risks and solutions. Before we get started, I think it's important that everyone kind of understands who the panelists are today. So I'm going to provide brief backgrounds. Dr. Muller is an internationally prominent scholar who specializes in the political economy of information and communication. He's the author of 7 books and multiple journal articles, and his work informs not only public policy, but the science and technology studies of law, economics, communications, and international studies. His books, Will the Internet Fragment? Networks and States, The Global Politics of Internet Governance, and Ruling the Root, Internet Governance and Taming of Cyberspace, are acclaimed scholarly journals of the global governance regimes emerging around the Internet. Dr. Muller's research employs theoretical tools of institutional economics and political economy, as well as historical, qualitative, and quantitative methods. His prominence in scholarship is matched by his prominence in policy practice. He's the co-founder and director of the Internet Governance Project, a policy analysis center for global internet governance. Dr. Kareem Farhat is a tech industry policy analyst and serves as the assistant director for the Internet Governance Project. He's designed and executed research in cybersecurity, the industrial Internet of Things, Internet identifiers, and information operations. His PhD thesis studied which of the 2 policy problems, US-China rivalry or information technology and operational technology convergence, and better explains the degrees of coherence and integration in the US cybersecurity regime. And quickly, myself, I'm a geoeconomic and national security strategist who focuses on global capital markets. My research on evaluating national security, trade policy, and economics is grounded in a mosaic grand strategy at the convergence of collaboration, competition, and pure conflict game theory. I focus my consulting work on CFIUS and national security investment reviews, having advised on national security strategy and enforcement for CFIUS transactions totaling over $100 billion in transaction value. I also serve on the board of directors of 2 US mitigated companies who have ultimate Chinese ownership that are under CFIUS jurisdiction. My PhD dissertation was focused on the feasibility of game theory approaches and investigating the threats to US national security from foreign investment. So hopefully that contextualizes for everyone where the 3 of us are coming from in terms of analyzing this very critical issue. Throughout this session, we're going to seek to explore the factors involved in determining both public opinion and the national security threat analysis, including examining the corporate structure of TikTok and ByteDance, the business model, and technical assessments of the application. Importantly, how and why America sets policy as it relates to technology companies is of critical importance in today's interconnected world. And fundamentally, this case is at the forefront of that debate. So I again want to thank Dr. Muller and Dr. Farhat for joining me today, and would like to kick off by asking you both why you elected to do this research, why now, and why do you feel it is so important in today's conversation?
Well, I'll start. Why now? Because we, frankly, when we first heard the idea about banning TikTok, I laughed. I mean, I thought it was self-evidently absurd and contrary to everything the United States believes about internet policy. But it became clear that there is a political faction in the United States that is really making an issue of this. It's primarily symbolic. It's a way for them to essentially promote decoupling from China. And they seem to not care about the consequences for free speech and free trade. So this chorus of calls to ban TikTok obviously started reaching a crescendo in December when we had this state legislative action, including here in Georgia. And now we have these national proposals to ban TikTok. So we thought it was really time to lay out the facts and do a basic threat analysis and assess, what was the case being made.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say thanks for giving us the platform, John. All I would add to this is that, yeah, we were really just struck by this use of a national security trump card in this case, and struck by just the level of policy diffusion that happened state after state. It was really fast, and there was not a lot of critical thinking involved. So we felt like we had to do this.
Yeah, thank you very much for that perspective. And look, I think you are both correct in saying that this type of analysis and ultimately taking this position on the TikTok national security review process is likely the minority view. I think that you both know that you are likely in the minority of this discussion. And I think to the point Dr. Muller made, what seems to be happening is that potentially all of this frustration that we've seen US legislators and politicians have had over big tech for a number of years, the Facebooks, Googles, Twitters that we've had here in the United States is now being focused on ByteDance. And I believe that may be happening because now there's a common enemy that we can focus on, and we've created what is this boogeyman of sorts, right? Where we can create a common enemy, and it is fundamentally much easier to pick a fight with a Chinese-owned company and win and get broad-based support for that than it is to pick a fight with an American big tech company for many of the same issues. Did you notice that as you were conducting your analysis, or did that perhaps help to inform your analysis at all as you were looking through some of these important issues?
Absolutely. The issue of the manipulation of the algorithm, the recommendation algorithm, known as For You in TikTok, is clearly building upon certain kinds of moral panics we've been having about the role of algorithmic recommendations. So these analyses typically attribute enormous powers to recommendation algorithms in a completely unscientific way, when in fact the recommendation algorithms essentially can reinforce and build upon preferences that end users express by what videos they look at, what actions they take, what they like, and so on. And then, of course, the whole game is to engage the user and make them susceptible to or to help advertisers link their advertisements to people who would be interested in them. And whatever you think about that process, it's really on TikTok no different than what's happening with Facebook or even Twitter. But again, if you can somehow say that algorithmic management of recommendations is some kind of mind control device, and then that mind control device is being wielded by the Chinese Communist Party, which again, it isn't. TikTok is not the Chinese Communist Party, but if you can sort of imply that, then you've got a really appealing case for American nationalists.
And to your point, John, about competition policy, it's kind of ironic that for the first time when we see this new market entrant that is threatening the dominant incumbents, that we suddenly forget the fact that this is actually creating more competition in this space. But it's very convenient to sort of tie all these ideological bundles, like saying that TikTok is digital fentanyl, for instance. I saw this one the other day. These are all separate issues, but the point here is much more important. We're talking about a national security threat, and we need to be careful about these sorts of claims.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And do you think there's just a fundamental misunderstanding across perhaps government and across the general populace about how algorithms work in terms of many people believing they're a black box? And Dr. Muller, I think you you kind of hinted to this, that they have, you know, quite complex, but it's kind of a mathematical underlay. What you engage with is more of what you get in return, right? And to your point, I think whether you agree or disagree with what people coin as surveillance capitalism, right? Being able to specifically target people for advertisements for something or another. Do you think it is just a fundamental misunderstanding or kind of undereducation on how algorithms work?
To be blunt, I don't think it's a misunderstanding when you're talking about people like Chris Wray of the FBI or Marco Rubio. I think it is a deliberate manipulation of the dialogue. It is, you could even say, disinformation, because what they're saying is that, number one, the algorithm could be somehow used to warp everybody's mind to support the Communist Party of China. And that this would be in the interests of TikTok as a corporation. And both of these things are clearly not true. Unless you believe that there's a latent groundswell of support for Xi Jinping in the American population among young people, that's just not a credible scenario. And all an algorithm can do is sort of detect what you're interested in and try to continue to engage you by feeding you additional videos that reflect those interests and likes. And it's not clear to me that the 90 million Americans who are using TikTok and watching videos on it are terribly interested in, you know, Communist Party propaganda. And if they are interested in Communist Party propaganda, they don't need to get it from TikTok. They can get it, they can find it on Google, they can find it on Twitter, and numerous other sources. So the whole sort of information operations case against TikTok is pretty ridiculous.
I would add also that there have been empirical investigations into how the algorithm actually works and whether it censors information and is skewed towards a particular position. Citizen Lab in Toronto conducted thorough research and could not find any conclusive evidence that there was anything skewing the algorithm.
Well, TikTok, I mean, Citizen Lab actually just looked at the search terms, whether those were censored, which is what the Chinese market applications have to do. They have to put in forbidden words into search terms. The only way to really investigate what the algorithm does is to use TikTok and see what you get. And you do not, you know, in my experience, it's pretty, I mean, it's very interesting what they feed me, but none of it is politically motivated. It's clearly based on other people I have followed, on sorts of tendencies that I spend time on. And it's in their interest as a business to do that and not to try to feed me a political ideology that I've expressed no interest in.
And that is not to say that there is no content moderation or that they might not skew the algorithms in certain ways to benefit the bottom line. I mean, for a while, I know that we discuss in the paper how TikTok was actually trying to limit negative content, trying to keep a happy platform, so to speak, but then they decided against it eventually. But there's nothing about, you know, amplifying CCP voices or anything that obvious that is out there. Otherwise, we would have seen it.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that what that leads into is another very interesting question, which is a lot of people ask, show me the there, right? And Dr. Farhat and Dr. Muller, you've kind of hinted towards this. I think that in many cases, there's very carefully couched language used as it relates to TikTok, which is could be used as, may be used as, right? We've not seen definitive statements coming from at least anyone that I've publicly seen saying, definitely does this, and here is the proof of that, right? Where you say, here is the there. And do you think that is important to be considering? And you think that's one of the questions that everyone should be asking, which is, show me, right? Show me the there. Do you think that's important?
Well, of course, there is no there, and that's why they are always reverting to the could be. Um, and you could say, you could make a legitimate case that there is a risk that, let's say, somehow, the Communist Party marches policemen into ByteDance headquarters in Beijing, puts a gun to the head of everybody associated with it, kidnaps maybe all of the foreign board members and instructs them all that they must turn TikTok into a propaganda organ for the Communist Party. That, I think that's a very, very unlikely thing. And I also think that if they did that, it would be immediately evident and that the appeal and following of the platform would decline immediately. And this is the other thing that, just boggles my mind about the argument that it's a propaganda or influence operations threat. If you talk to young people who use TikTok, you realize that they are embedded in a media ecosystem in which they are sharing videos across multiple platforms, right? You can see videos on TikTok, and some of the most popular people I follow also have YouTube accounts, and they're putting up videos there, and they may be doing things on Twitter, they may be doing things on Facebook. So the idea that one app is going to suddenly change the minds of the entire American people in ways that they have no propensity to believe, it's just not credible. It's unbelievable how anybody could take that seriously, because the US has a very diverse and open information ecosystem. And just not to go on too long, Kareem may want to get in here, but one of the important facts about what's happened in the last 2 or 3 years is the fact that platforms are not locked, users of platforms are not locked in, right? So people have really stopped using Instagram and Facebook as much as they used to. They've either gotten bored with it or they don't like its policies. And TikTok has emerged because it did things that people liked better. And I think it's quite evident that if TikTok started to be something that was a boring, propagandistic, or tilted and slanted kind of a platform that was feeding people things they don't want, I think users would abandon it. And I think that's a very important market-based check on any kind of attempt to manipulate it.
Yeah, I think you speak to something, and your analysis is the only one that I've seen on this topic, but going to first principles and saying, this is a commercially driven entity that has investors like Tiger Global at a $460 billion valuation, like Morgan Stanley, like Sequoia Capital, like Susquehanna, right? Just large venture firms, right? Some of which are based in the United States, who have a lot of capital in TikTok and ByteDance, and by virtue of that, TikTok. And to that point, I think your analysis does do a very interesting job about talking about this commercial focus, and then talking about the funding types as well. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Sure, I will do that. Do you want to do that, Kareem?
I was just letting seniority go first, but sure. Yeah, and you're absolutely right, John. I think TikTok was initially seeded by an investment of $5 million by Susquehanna. And it's, I think, today worth something like $15 billion. And there's a lot of venture capital that came in as they grew and diversified their service offerings. ByteDance has a lot of services. They're mostly known for TikTok. And the way this is something that's also doesn't get mentioned as much in the discussions about Chinese platforms, is that the way that they can actually globalize and get out from the Chinese market is that they set up these shell companies like in the Cayman Islands. And this is the way that ByteDance is operating. There's this distinction between onshore and offshore capital in China, as you know. So they were forced to set up this convoluted organizational structure, just like many others did, just to be able to comply with the data governance requirements of different jurisdictions.
Yeah, and I think that's very interesting because to me, it's very logical to support the statements that you all are making, which is if TikTok is or would become a propaganda tool for the CCP, users would likely stop using it, which would then create, very significant commercial downside for a lot of these investors, right? So it is not in TikTok's general interest or ByteDance's general commercial or economic interest to do so.
Yeah, and I think that's again, that's one of the most dangerous things about the attack on TikTok is that, taken to its logical conclusion, essentially this is an attack on any form of trade and capital, transnational capital investment between the US and the Chinese economies. And that has enormous consequences for economic growth and for global growth. And I believe that is indeed the hidden agenda behind many of the people who are behind this attack. It's that they just want to set up a tech nationalism. They want to segment the global economy. They want to decouple the United States and China. And I think when they attack a company that's clearly commercially motivated and abiding by sort of Western approaches to social media platforms, and is something that is actively welcomed and used by millions of American users, I think they've gone a bridge way too far, and they really have to be stopped, because this is getting to the point where we're shooting ourselves in the foot.
Right. So I can see there are some questions coming into the Q&A box as well, and we will try to get to those. At this point, I do want to pause because we're about halfway through, and I do want to point out, for those of you who have read this report, I would want to draw focus to the first page and be clear that the report did not receive any funding from TikTok, ByteDance, or any interested party. And the Internet Governance Project as an organization has not received funding from TikTok at any point in history, right? So I just want to make clear that this report and the analysis and the opinions that are being talked about during this discussion are an independent voice, right? Because that often is, some of the questions or some of the critiques around why did you do this? Why was this done? Why now? So I want to make clear that is footnoted on the first page of this report, that it was not funded by any of the interested parties that we're discussing today. We have focused a lot of the discussion here in the first 30 minutes on the influence operations, kind of the human factors, and I do think we'll probably come back to that. But I also want to make sure that we're touching on the technical cybersecurity risks. And could you guys kind of expand on the threat analysis that you looked at as it related to the alleged or the theoretical cybersecurity risks that may exist, how those may be overcome, and potential solutions there?
Yes, the main cybersecurity threat analysis pertains to data. That is to say, obviously, social media platforms of any type gather a lot of data about the behavior of their users. And so the question is this data, number one, does it go from TikTok directly into the hands of the Ministry of Public Security or some other Chinese intelligence agency, the PLA, whatever? And if it does, how valuable is that data? How dangerous is that data? And we looked at that, and the first point you have to make is, if you are somebody in a sensitive national security position doing activities that you record on TikTok and publish on TikTok, then yeah, you may be creating a national security threat. But there's nothing unique about TikTok in that regard. If you are on YouTube and you are a CIA agent and you're taking videos of where you're going and what you're doing, that's probably a bad thing to do for national security. If you're on Facebook and you're doing something similar, it's a bad thing. The point being that the social media is all about publishing your activities, and there's a tremendous amount of information you can gather from scanning, scraping, or various other kinds of software tools. You can learn a lot about what people are doing, what their followers are, their identifying information, their location. And you can do that simply by looking at what these people are doing on social media, and you can do it by creating sock puppet accounts that gather information from followers and so on. So the idea that there's some uniquely dangerous risk about TikTok as a social media app in terms of data and espionage, even if you assume the Chinese government gets access to all of it, I don't think it's a big deal. And then there's a question of, do they get access to it? Again, you have to deal with the incentives of TikTok as a commercial actor. Why would they turn over that data? There's an appendix in the report that I would encourage everyone to read. It's about the so-called Chinese National Intelligence Law. And the people attacking TikTok have made a big deal about this a few years ago. They said, oh, there's a section in there that says that people shall cooperate with the national intelligence. And it's like it's this little very vague, broad statement. And right after that, there's a statement in the same law that says China's national intelligence agencies will respect everyone's human rights and will never violate their privacy. And there's other kinds of things like that throughout the law. The point is that I don't think either one of those sections of the law should be taken literally. I think you have to look at what actually happens with China's security agencies. And it's typically they will collect information and surveil people and spy on people in China. And they will definitely have a foreign intelligence operation that will look at and try to track sensitive actors overseas. They definitely do that. The idea that they need TikTok data to do that, there's just no evidence for that. And there's no evidence that unless a foreign, unless our CIA agents and FBI agents are really stupid and are promoting things about themselves on these public media, there's no particular gain, no particular value from trying to get TikTok data from ByteDance.
Right, and the more perhaps subtle critiques of TikTok have to do with influence operations and whether, say, they would be coaxing certain influencers to promote certain goals here or there. But that also boils down to will people still want to use the application as a result of this? And there has not been any thorough empirical investigation of this. We have not seen people doing tests of this.
Yeah, I think from a cybersecurity standpoint, and as a CFIUS practitioner for over a decade, from a technical threat assessment standpoint, and based on all of the public reporting that's been out there, and I do think we have seen the narrative shift quite a bit. That's coming from some politicians and some government officials. I believe it started with access to data and data storage and focusing on China's national security laws where they could get the data. And I think TikTok very, elegantly, quite frankly, said, that's fine. We'll store all the data with Oracle in the United States, and Oracle is the custodian of the data, which from a technical standpoint, I think in a lot of cases stopped or effectively mitigated that national security risk, which in some instances is a real threat, right? And this is not to say, and I want to be clear throughout this discussion, that national security threats do exist. And in some contexts, social media platforms or other platforms that have significant amounts of data collection can, in fact, present national security risks. But can those risks be mitigated? And in all cases, data privacy does not equate to national security. And I think that's important. And you've seen this narrative shift from technical threat assessments or cybersecurity threat assessments, which, again, TikTok seems to have somewhat effectively mitigated with the Oracle relationship that's been very public, and the CEO has been very public about talking about, to this potential influence operation, the human side of it. I think we've shifted towards, and I don't know that people have a clean answer to that, or a sufficient answer. And I think that's where we're sitting on the debate. And I think Dr. Miller and Dr. Farhat, you do try to address a lot of that influence operation, perhaps because you're in agreement that the technical risks that have been identified have been effectively mitigated. Would you agree with that?
Actually, I would push back on that a little bit, because I do not believe in data localization as a good policy, right? The whole point of the internet and the cloud infrastructure is that you store data securely wherever it makes economic sense, and you share across boundaries to fully leverage the capabilities of the internet. Now, the main so you do not necessarily make data more secure by storing it within a particular geography, right? You can, however, mitigate the risk of jurisdictional requests, right? So if this data is stored in China, the problem is not that it's more secure technically. The problem is that legally, China would have the authority to say to whatever cloud provider was storing it there, you have to turn over this data, right? And so that's why data localization is adopted. Typically, it is to require, and particularly by authoritarian countries, it is, they want the data to be where they can get at it, right? So in some sense, yes, it is a clever move by TikTok to say, okay, we'll use Oracle to store our data. But if China is really intent on getting that data, we have seen various kinds of break-ins, regardless of whether it's a Chinese company or an American company or a European company. The Chinese have, that is to say, the Chinese PLA or intelligence agencies have consistently broken into certain forms of sensitive American data. For example, the most embarrassing case is the famous Office of Personnel Management case. That is national security relevant data, and they got it. And it was, it was just because we were very badly organized in terms of cybersecurity. So if this TikTok data or social media data, actually shouldn't talk about TikTok, if social media data is so valuable, you could see them trying to break into Facebook, YouTube, whatever. And again, they could use all kinds of open source intelligence tools that would not require them to break into anything. But if it was really valuable, they would invest in breaking into that, regardless of whether it's TikTok or any other social media platform.
There's this very common narrative nowadays that data is the new oil, as if it's a precious resource to be harvested, and then we should all be in some kind of race to accumulate more and more data. But you have to ask yourself at one point, it's like, what is the value of this data? Data is co-produced between people and social media platforms, and it's used for specific purposes. You can't just apply these blanket statements and justify that to erect just completely different systems and undermine the efficiency of the internet. And this data localization solution comes at a tremendous cost. It's something like $1.5 billion, and these figures are supposed to be recurring on an ongoing basis, while this backend infrastructure is set up with Oracle. So, what other small startup company is going to be able to continue operating under these conditions if we're talking about market competition? This is tremendously harmful.
This is another example of how the US is really departing from its own global policies. We have been trying to negotiate trade agreements in the digital sphere for more than a decade that prohibits data localization requirements. And now we're doing it, right? And you think that's going to be good for American social media companies? I mean, or even for American cloud companies? Are we going to force everybody in the world to set up separate infrastructures in every individual country because of these legal and so-called cybersecurity concerns? If we do that, then who are the leading cloud companies in the world? Who are the leading social media companies? They're American companies. So again, we're shooting ourselves in the foot here in order to kind of, I really think it's this fear of China and the idea that we think incorrectly that we can't compete with it in the global economy, when in fact we can, and we benefit from having a globalized, open internet. And China is the one that needs to worry about localizing data and protecting themselves from foreign influence.
What was General Keith Alexander's famous dictum about our long-term strategic objective should be to have freedom of operation in any given domain and deny the enemy the same. So if we're closing ourselves off, we're basically shooting ourselves in the foot. We need to be courageous enough to follow through on our stated principles and not operate through this organized hypocrisy, as political scientist Stephen Krasner put it.
And I've been watching, the evolution of internet policy for 20 years. And when the US does something, you inevitably get this model function. And they say, oh, the US is restricting speech, then a Brazilian or a Turkish or a Russian dictatorship will say, we can do that too. The Americans are doing it. So we will definitely set an example with a incredibly sweeping data localization agreement with TikTok, and we can expect that to have global effects that redound negatively to American companies. So I hope Mark Zuckerberg is listening.
I'm sure he will watch the recording back. So I do want to touch on this data concept, right? Because I do think a lot of people inherently do believe, like you said, Dr. Farhat, that data is the new oil, right? Data presents this extremely valuable asset. And in your report, you do talk a lot about, you acknowledge, I think, that data is important, but then say, which data fields specifically does TikTok capture that are either a threat to national security, not a threat to data privacy, but a distinct threat to national security? And which of those are inherently unique only to TikTok, like you could only get them via TikTok? And then you talk a lot about these open source tools and concepts like data brokers who essentially sell data, perhaps much more sensitive data than is in TikTok. So I was wondering if you could kind of expand on that concept in terms of, is the data really that unique, and can you directly tie it to national security?
Yeah, in fact, I think it is not. All the open source tools that are out there allow you to assign a unique identifier to a person and track that person across platforms. We have the tools to do that. They're out there. And if we're talking in terms of geolocation, what type of OS and device that is being used, I really fail to see how this would have any sort of national security ramifications. Of course, with the exception being unless you have a national security function, or perhaps you're a congressional representative using TikTok. I know that there's a lot of Democratic representatives still using TikTok, and I would hope that they would be using that on a second device or through a media-only phone. But other than that, I really fail to see how we would be giving up this precious resource to China or the CCP.
There's a question in the chat from my colleague Hans Klein. So he's saying, yeah, doesn't China ban apps, don't they? Let's see how that goes. They ban Tesla vehicles because they collect data. Isn't it reasonable for the US government to do the same? And our whole point is that no, we do not want to be China. China censors its domestic companies. They definitely control content, and they limit what you can say on social media, and they definitely surveil domestic social media. They definitely surveil domestic users of social media. Recent article just today in the Wall Street Journal, I think, about one of the protesters of the COVID getting locked up. So they do all that domestically, no question about it. Nobody here is saying that China is a wonderful system. It is a dictatorship. It is a one-party monopoly. It's a bad system of political governance. And it's a threat to the security of Chinese people or other people who live under that system. There's no question about that. The question is, TikTok is not the Chinese Communist Party. TikTok does not operate in China. It's a global app, and it represents an attempt by a private company to participate in global markets. And we ought to be encouraging that. Those kinds of things are actually things that make China a little bit more open. And the tech crackdown in China is an indication of the fact that China itself views these globalized tech firms as a bit of a threat, and we should be encouraging them, not trying to kill them.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's an important point. And this is a complex question, or this particular issue I think is very complex, which is it leads into the apps are different, right? As you mentioned, Dr. Miller, TikTok is a global app. Douyin is the Chinese version, right? And a lot of people will point to that differentiator as one of the perhaps justifications for trying to ban the application. And what I think it's important to remember is what you mentioned, which is China, as a sovereign nation, sets laws, sets regulations that fit the society or that they push towards the society. The United States has very limited capability to force any application, maybe it be Facebook being a US app, to say users can only use this application for 1 hour a day and only for educational purposes, right? America doesn't do that, right? So I think to say, well, because China has a different app than the United States and they treat their citizens in a different way, I'm not sure that's kind of a fair comparison to draw. Do you have an opinion on that?
No, I think it's a perfect comparison to draw. It's do you want an authoritarian government that controls media and speech, or do you want a free and open society where, yeah, we're going to get some messages from foreign countries, but we have more resilience precisely because we are free. We're used to getting conflicting ideas and different ideas, and we know how to handle it. I remember way back in 1996, I was speaking in Hong Kong to somebody from the Chinese government about censorship on the internet. And he was like, in America, if somebody says something, it's like it's in this flood and it doesn't necessarily have any power. But if we allow people to say things in China, then everybody will think it's authorized, right? And they're kind of caught in a trap. They can't allow free speech because, it might gain legitimacy. Criticism might gain legitimacy. But on the other hand, they know that there are severe costs in their restrictions of speech in terms of the satisfaction of their people, the inefficiency of their economy, the lack of feedback on their public policies. They know that. I mean, look at the COVID protests, right? That was a remarkable event. And by the way, I got the most information about the COVID protests from TikTok. I got long videos showing incredible scenes of these street protests. I On Twitter, of course, Twitter was flooded by spam originating from China that was meant to divert people's attention from these COVID protest videos that were being circulated on Twitter. So in that respect, Twitter was more manipulated by China than by China's government than TikTok.
Yeah, and I think it's a lot of that influence operation. And you described this in your report, noting that there is no current scientific basis for the belief that if you control a recommendation algorithm, it would allow an adversary to influence a population strongly enough to generate a national security threat, right? You're just saying, algorithms predict what users might like based on their past activity on the platform, their dwell time on a video, their engagement with the video, similar things that they might have liked in the past. But that there's no basis or nothing that's been shown to say algorithms can either control or change what a user likes or what their position or interests are. Can you kind of describe what you looked at there and the foundation for that position?
Well, there's a lot of research about that. Some of it is still contested. Like there are people who believe that algorithms and algorithmic social media have contributed to polarization, political polarization in the United States. But really, if you look carefully at that, you find very weak effects, right? For example, the United States kind of shot itself in the foot in our reaction to the Russian influence operations. Sorry, my phone just rang and totally threw you off the screen. So the actual Russian influence operations did try to leverage existing fissures in the American polity. For example, pretending that they were mobilizing a racist sentiment or trying to convince Black people not to go to the polls because it would be futile or something like that. So a highly sophisticated influence operation can try to play on these divisions that pre-exist in society. But the impact of that is very small. Right? It's like there are millions of other people doing different things on these social media. It's not the only thing. And again, if it were the only thing, nobody would be subscribing to TikTok. Nobody really is that interested in seeing that. So I think that you cannot attach an unrealistic level of influence to these kinds of algorithmic recommendations. And you have to just recognize the fact that the commercial incentives of the social media providers is not to make them into political activists or manipulators. It is to make them into profitable, businesses.
Thank you very much for that perspective. So as we close out on these last 10 minutes, what I'd like to do is, for me, I'd like to pause for a second and give you, Dr. Muller, and you, Dr. Farhat, if there's anything I didn't ask you about, I would like to give you both the opportunity for some parting thoughts so that we're not rushed on those at the very end. But if you had parting thoughts, parting recommendations, or what the US population and potentially policymakers, regulatory officials should be considering as it relates to TikTok and national security moving forward.
Sure, I could go ahead. So I guess my biggest policy recommendation in this case would be to tread lightly and be careful about the precedent that this is going to set. So we know for a fact that a deal is currently being brokered between TikTok and CFIUS. We've been having a few conversations with people from TikTok, and there's going to be revelations about this sometime in the future. So this deal is in fact going on, but the precedent that is being set is going to be very detrimental for the open state of the internet. especially given the principles that we advocate for in the US. And we should not be foregoing long-term strategy, if we're thinking like a strategic thinker, for short-term political gains. And there's a lot of special interest at work here without going into details. One should be examining the types of lobbying and money that is going around Congress. And we should all be asking ourselves critical questions and trying not to bundle ideological problems together, like saying that social media is bad. There's been a lot of research, like mass communication type research in the 70s that deals with this so-called magic bullet theory, how people are going to get influenced by mass media and they're going to completely change their opinions and be corrupted through it. That's just simply not the case. That's been proven time and time again. Yes, algorithms have certain problems, and we need to be asking ourselves these questions as a society when it comes to privacy and cybersecurity and recommendation and all these things, but they do not rise to the level of national security. And I think that is the point here. Thank you.
Yeah, John, the only thing I think we didn't cover, there was an incident that again gets sort of manipulated in this debate. So there were journalists trying to sort of get internal information out of TikTok. And the company did use internal information to track their employees in order to find out who was leaking information to these journalists. And that's, you know, an ambiguous situation in terms of how you would evaluate that. I don't think it's cut and dried. You know, any company has the right to kind of track who is leaking sensitive data. But I think the most important point that gets lost, I think sometimes deliberately, is that this was TikTok, the company, using the data to track their own employees. It was not the Chinese Communist Party using this data or having access to this data to track these employees or these journalists. So I think that's an important factual point that, again, people continually blur this line between ByteDance as a private corporation and the Chinese Communist Party, and their whole case kind of consists of blurring that line and making people fuse the two together.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, and I'm glad you touched upon that. And coming from me, my parting thought here would be to echo what Dr. Farhat said, which is I think we need to be very careful with national security investment reviews, not to have a national securitization of industrial policy. I think we need to be very clear and very careful to identify distinct national security risks on one hand, and then evaluate industrial policy or, you know, political positions in kind of global grand strategy on another. And we can mitigate a lot of the technical and cybersecurity risks with the tools that we have on hand. And even things like manipulation of the algorithm and what kind of things are be showing, I do believe can be effectively mitigated and monitored to ensure that any potential or perceived national security threat can be addressed. But I would also be very careful in when we're listening to public discourse on this topic, the type of language that is being used, the could be, should be, might be type language, and question whether there is distinct evidence of something occurring, and does that rise to the level of a national security risk, right? So the national securitization of industrial policy is something that I think presents a risk for the United States globally if we move in that direction.
Really glad to hear you say that, John, because I think that is indeed sort of what motivated. We just see national security being extended, not just to military things, and CFIUS reviews being extended into more and more of the areas. And in many ways, this is, like, again, taking us down a economic policy path that's very similar to China and to a kind of a socialist or authoritarian state where the economy is not a matter of people freely trading to maximize their interests, but but is all under the rubric of power and national security. And I think that's going to be a very unhealthy direction for the US to take.
Yeah, an interagency body just dictating investment by fiat sounds awfully Soviet to me.
Well, we have reached the conclusion of our hour, so hopefully all of the attendees found value in this. I am very grateful for you, Dr. Muller, and you, Dr. Farhad, for joining me today for this very important discussion. I think this is a discussion that needs to be had, frankly, more publicly. And I think that this opinion needs to be more broadly debated. I do highly encourage every attendee, please review the wonderful analysis and white paper that was put out by these two scholars. And for any additional questions, I believe all three of us are pretty easy to find on the internet. That's using those open source tools to find data. We're all very easy to find. Please feel free to reach out to any of us or the collective of us if you've got any additional questions. But thank you so much for joining, and thank you very much to my co-panelists here today.
Thank you so much, John. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone.